Good afternoon, welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar, and I'm Deputy Director of the LSE South Asia Centre here at the London School of Economics. A very warm welcome to all of you to this afternoon's event, which is being and we're delighted to have all of you here for this event. You will have noticed that we've just inserted a message in the chat box for those of you who are watching on YouTube. I'm delighted to welcome this afternoon's panelists and experts for this event, which is titled 2025, A New World Order. I'm not going to say very much at all, not only because I'm not an expert in any way on this subject, but more because I don't really think the title requires too much of explanation. But the last year has been extremely eventful. I focus on a few comments on South Asia, namely that 4 countries in the region, in the order of Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and then Sri Lanka in November, went to national elections. The elections in Bangladesh brought back the government of Sheikh Hasina, which was very dramatically ousted in August by a student-led unrest, leading to her moving out of the country, escaping the country, and she's now in Delhi in India. Sri Lanka brought a left of center government for the first time, ending leadership that had come principally from a very small group of families from whom most presidents and prime ministers had come. And that has been a very, very radically different thing. There have been other very important events even in this year, significantly in the Middle East, the ousting of Assad, to say absolutely nothing about the continuing war in Ukraine and a new president in the United States. All this alongside, over the last several years, the emergence of China, of India, of Russia into the geopolitics of the region and of the world, which has, to put it quite simply, altered the dynamics of the rules-based international order that was known over the decades since the Second World War. And that's really what we're going to focus on today, how these various new players in the field, including the European Union, have changed. Have they changed? If they have changed, the world order, and is a new world order in the making? I'm not going to say more, as I said, because we have an expert, but before that, a very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us from various time zones. Thank our events. You are really the reason why we do it. As you will see, the chat function is enabled. Please type your questions there, and we will pose your questions to the panelists at irregular intervals once they have made their initial remarks. You are welcome to ask a question to an individual panelist. You are equally welcome to pose a question to the complete panel, and we'll take turns. Few other kinds of tweets, then you're very welcome to tweet and tag us. You will see all the Twitter handles put up in the description on your YouTube page. More importantly, I should mention here that had this event been happening on site at LSE, you would have had the opportunity as members of the audience to ask a question to panelists without revealing your identity. Now, in keeping as close to that spirit as possible, when I ask questions posed by you, I will not be announcing your names. I'll simply read out the question is visible to others, but we'll at least stay as close to the spirit as possible. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce the speakers of this afternoon's panel. I should say that we have apologies from Dr. Sanjay Ruparelia, who was supposed to speak on India, but he has been taken unwell and therefore has sent his regrets and is unable to participate. We've had a quick chat before we started, and the way in which we're going to do this, for those of you who saw our advertisement on our website or received our e-notice, is that the event actually sprung from an article that one of our speakers, Dr. Jerome Roos, had written in the New Statesman earlier last year in the summer, from which I have requested Jerome to spend 5 minutes just laying out the basic ideas in that article and the argument around which the conversation today is going to be organized by the speakers. Dr. Jerome Roos, who is also the discussant for this afternoon's event, is Fellow in International Political Economy in the talking about the rules-based order, was published in June 2024 in the New Statesman and forms the starting point of this afternoon's event. Jerome is also the author of Why Not Default? The Political Economy of Sovereign Debt, which was published in 2019. Once Jerome has spoken, each of our panelists will then make initial remarks of about 8-10 minutes, 6 to 8 minutes, depending on how many countries they're covering. Michael Cox is Emeritus Professor of International Relations at LSE and author of several books, but most relevant for this afternoon's event is The Post-Cold War World, Turbulence and Change in World Politics Since the Fall, which was published in 2018. On Russia and on China. Dr. Ahmet Edi Öztürk is Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at London Metropolitan University and author of Religion, Identity and Power, Turkey and the Balkans in the 21st Century, which was published in 2021. Edi will speak on Turkey, of course. Ellen Sjursen is Research Professor at Arena Center for European Studies at the University Rethinking Liberal Order, the EU and the Quest for Global Justice. There's an article published in 2023. Now, before I invite Jerome to speak, I also want to say that all of you who wish to access these articles or the details of the publications I've announced, those are available on our website and will be available after this afternoon in the archives of our events. Having said that, Jerome to make his initial comments. Jerome, please speak now.
Thank you so much, Nilanjan. It's really wonderful to be connected with all of you and to be talking about this super important topic at this very critical time in history. Nilanjan, while you were speaking, you cut out several times, and I'm not sure if it was my connection or yours. If it was mine and I cut out, then please just raise your hand and I will restate some of the points that I made. So Nilanjan asked me to basically go through the main argument of the piece that I wrote in the New Statesman last June it was. And I thought it would be good to maybe reverse a little bit, zoom out a little bit and remind ourselves of the context in which I wrote that piece. It was around that time that the International Criminal Court in The Hague issued an arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. And I was particularly struck at that time by the response of the US government, in particular by President Biden's response to that issuing of the arrest warrant. Biden called the warrant outrageous, and he basically made it very clear that he felt that Israel was not committing genocide in Gaza, not committing war crimes in Gaza, and had a right to defend himself. Now that response obviously contrasted very sharply to the response of the Biden administration to what had happened in Ukraine over the preceding 2 years. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion, and the Biden administration openly called President Putin of Russia a dictator and accused him of undermining the rules-based international order. And so that was kind of the starting point for my piece. I was trying to figure out why is it that the Biden administration is responding so differently to these two events. Now, one obvious answer to that question would be, well, it's hypocrisy. It's the US measuring with double standards. And I believe that there's obviously an element of truth in that. But I believe the problem goes deeper. And so what I tried to do in that piece is to actually figure out what is it about the rules-based international order as an idea, as a concept that might be problematic to begin with. And so what I kind of try to do in the piece is basically, it's a little bit of a genealogy of a concept. Now, of course, this is a piece written for a non-academic outlet. So I had to do it in very brief layman's terms. I don't have time to go through the full argument here now, but basically what I want to restate is the argument that I end up making, which is that this is actually, the rules-based international order is actually a fairly novel concept. It's not something, despite the framing that emerges around it, it's not something that actually goes back to the post-war years. It's something that only emerged in the last 10 to 15 years. And that's very clear when you do an Ngram research and look at how often the word has appeared in academic publications. I mean, the word basically wasn't used before the year 2000, and it really didn't become used in a sort of public sense by US government officials or news outlets until the early 2010s. And so the question that I'm trying to answer is, why did that happen and how did that happen? Instead of walking through the entire sort of process of how that happened, I just want to sort of end where it becomes a publicly used term. And that really only happens around 2010, when Hillary Clinton, who was then the Secretary of State, used it for the first time, or at least as a US government representative, used it for the first time in a very particular geopolitical context. The United States started speaking of the rules-based international order in the context of what was known as President Obama's pivot to Asia, which was basically an attempt to reorient the United States away from its traditional Atlanticist focus towards the Indo-Pacific region. And that, of course, was part of a larger sort of geopolitical agenda to try to come up with an answer to the rise of China, to shore up alliances in the region with countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, but also to extend the reach of US trade within that region. And it's really in that context that Hillary Clinton came up with this term, the rules-based order, the rules-based international order, as a way to counter what it saw as Chinese expansionism, especially in the South China Sea area. And the argument that I kind of make there is that this is not something that reflects an actual underlying truth, in the sense that the rules-based international order is not actually an existing thing. The rules-based international order does not exist. It's a rhetorical device. It's a rhetorical device that came out of certain democratic foreign policy circles around this time as a way to deal with the problem of waning US primacy within that specific region. You can see this fairly clearly when you look at some of the pronouncements of President Obama around this time. So in an op-ed for the Washington Post in 2016, Obama literally said, America should write the rules. America should call the shots. Other countries should play by the rules that America and our partners set, and not the other way around. So there, I think what we start seeing is that this language around the rules-based international order is actually a language that seeks to somehow obfuscate the reality of US power projection within the context of the rise of China and the emergence of a more multipolar world. And when I say that the rules-based international order does not exist, I do not mean to say that there are no international rules. I actually believe we do have a system of international rules. That's the system of international law. The problem is that that's not what the US invokes. And we can clearly see why in the case of Israel-Palestine. Because in that particular case, if the US had supported international law, it would have had to support the ICC's arrest warrant for Netanyahu instead of undermining it. So what happens here, I would argue, is that the RBIO, the rules-based international order, is not an actual real thing. It's actually something that's meant to distract from the existing system of international law that we have. And it's something that is used specifically in the context of this emergence of a more multipolar world to try to create a situation in which the US can still be the dominant rule setter, the dominant rule maker. And it's kind of, the piece was kind of written as a provocation because I was trying to say, well, perhaps those of us who are not based in the United States should be a little bit careful about that language of the rules-based international order. And for instance, in my case, coming from a continental European country, I was dismayed to see that many continental European leaders have thrown their weight behind this language and actually in the process, maybe subconsciously or maybe not even being aware of it, end up undermining the system that we do have, which is the system of international law. And so that was kind of the provocation that I was trying to make in the context of what was happening back then. Now, of course, we're in a very different context. We don't have the Biden administration anymore. We've got President Trump and his second coming. And clearly, President Trump does not care very much for the rules. President Trump cares about the deal. He cares about a more transactionalist approach. And so what we're seeing is a very different posture, at least rhetorically, by the United States on the international stage. So perhaps for me, it would be interesting to talk a little bit about what has changed also since I wrote that article. But, you know, just to conclude, I want to throw one more provocation in there, which is that in essence, both Trump's transactionalist approach and the more sort of rules-based approach of the Democratic Party reflect the same underlying phenomenon, which is an anxiety on the part of the US foreign policy establishment about the rise of China and about the emergence of a more multipolar world, and the fear that this induces that US primacy will no longer be the overwhelming fact in international affairs. And so that is my sort of reading of this situation. I'll just leave it at that. I'm very curious to hear what any of the other speakers might have to add to that or to contest in terms of my reading of the situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jerome. You have provoked enough. Our next speaker is Michael Cox, who is Emeritus Professor of International Relations at LSE and author of the Post-Cold War World Turbulence and Change in World Politics Since the Fall, which was published in 2018. And as I mentioned in my initial introductions, it's only one of his several publications. Mick has very kindly offered to speak on both Russia as well as China, which are his expertise. Mick, please speak now. You have about 10-ish minutes, maybe 12.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Nilanjan, for the invitation. And thanks for your provocation, Jerome, coming from a publication that the LSE has a long relationship with, given that the LSE directors at the time and GB Shaw created it back in 1913. So great to see you personally and to continue a long association with the good old New Statesman, as I say. I was thinking of Donald Trump when you were speaking, although I know you want me to speak on Russia and China. And you're probably right in some ways, Jerome, but it's a bit like saying you know what you don't have until you've actually gone and lost it. And Trump kind of makes us aware that there are a series of rules out there because he seems to be breaking every single one of them. So it does kind of raise a question whether or not, even if it may not be as well defined as you suggest, there has been certain assumptions, largely in the West, I accept that, but not only, about the way the world ought to be run. Yes, of course, this involves American primacy, but it also, I think, involved a certain sense of buy-in to globalization, a kind of sense of buy-in to not invading other people's countries. And I think from the Western point of view, although not everybody's, a buy-in to the notion that this order should in essence be or run by liberal powers. So you're quite right to say it may have been a little less known or well-defined until Hillary defined it in her own way in 2010. But I think there were certain assumptions there which came out of the end of the Cold War and the winning of the Cold War, which were there, if only implicitly, if not as explicitly as you say. So Nilanjan has asked me to write about Russia and China, which I've been thinking about for a very long time. I started life, by the way, just as an autobiographical note, as a Sovietologist, but I lost my subject in 1991. So I can't say I'm happy that China's come along to replace it, because I don't think China does replace the Soviet Union, except in some senses it does, and in other senses it doesn't. It's so different, and that's why I don't like the term New Cold War, for all sorts of reasons we can go into, but that's not what you've asked me to talk about. The question, it seems to me, in terms of the challenges to something, let's call it for the moment the rules-based order, is what role do Russia and China play in this? And it seems to me, together, they are playing an increasingly important part. I think that's only a statement of the obvious. And what I've tried to do in my own work briefly is to trace the origins of how Russia, post-communist Russia, and even before that, the Soviet Union and China came back together. Now, if one took a kind of longer-term view, bluntly, they shouldn't be strategic partners. If you go back to the late 19th century Russian imperialism, they, after all, took over very large chunks of the Far East and maintained control over that, and is now part of what was part of the Soviet Union and part of Russia. That Russia was part of the century of humiliation for China, after all. And the Chinese have very long memories about these kinds of things. It's not just the British or the French or the Boxer Rebellion. The other reason why you might say, well, why have these two rather very different countries and different cultures and very different economies as well? How do they come together in the first place? But how do they break up? And again, if you go through the Cold War period, certainly in the 60s and 70s, the divisions between them were just monstrous. I mean, they even went to war with one another. China started building nuclear shelters all over Chinese cities. There were 1.5 million soldiers on the border. It was a very highly militarized and a highly dangerous relationship. So how, in a sense, and this is my question, I think, Nilanjan, which I've tried to answer in my work, how is it they've overcome A, long-term history of the 19th century, and B, overcame the deep divide, which split them for the better part of 20 years and was both strategic, ideological, and economic. How did they do it? It is in a sense, a fascinating story. It begins in the 80s, ironically. I say ironically, I think you understand what I mean by that. It begins with Gorbachev after 85 in his reform program of perestroika, in a sense coinciding, and it was a coincidence, coinciding with the emergence of Deng Xiaoping as a reformer within China. Both wanted, in a sense, to settle the issue as quickly as possible, insofar as it was possible to do so quickly in any relationship between Russia and then the Soviet Union. But they met in 89 in Beijing and came to some kind of a broad agreement that they would try and solve the border, they would try and denuclearize their relationship, move troops back, and then, in a sense, move into new economic relations. Now, of course, we know what happened then. Tiananmen happened. And then, of course, 2-3 years later, as I discovered in my own academic subject, the Soviet Union disappeared. But nonetheless, the relationship continued in the 90s. It's a much understudied period in some ways in terms of the China-Russia relationship. Many of the dimensions of what founded the Russia-China relationship, which persist to this day, didn't begin 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 3 years ago. They began actually in the 1990s with Jiang Zemin and Boris Yeltsin. And I won't go into all the details, but it culminated in 2001 with a treaty. Now, many in the West at the time, by the way, didn't even take any notice of that treaty, but the Russians did and the Chinese did, and they refer to it quite a lot. What is in essence then happened was a beginning of an increasing rapprochement, a building of bridges between the two countries over the next 20 years before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Why did they come together? 3 very quick reasons. One, they didn't like the unipolar order, which Jerome mentioned. They didn't like the United States running the world. Secondly, they didn't like a world order anyway organized on liberal principles, which also implied intervention into the internal affairs of other states, particularly authoritarian ones like Russia and China. And thirdly, they just developed a very broad, similar foreign policy outlook about the world, about the global South, about the distribution of power within it. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't sudden. There were differences between the two for obvious reasons you can talk about. But nonetheless, what I found really quite remarkable is what some people once called a convenient relationship, an axis of convenience, it was once called by a old friend of mine back in 2008, actually has become a very serious strategic partnership. Is it involved increasing economic ties? It's involved increasing coincidence of positions inside the United Nations. It's involved increasing military exercises between the two countries, not only in the Pacific, but also in the Mediterranean and to some degree the Atlantic. And it's involved, to sum it up very briefly, a large number of meetings between the most senior Russian and Chinese officials over the last 20 years, particularly between the two leaders of the two countries, namely Putin and Xi Jinping. We come then to the war itself in February. I'll jump over the 2014 Ukraine war, but that is also an important turning point in the relationship. And there was quite a lot of feeling at the time, and I remember it very well, the degree to which most people said, aha, this is now going to show how weak the relationship is. This is going to show the divergent interest of Russia, if you like, the bully boy of Europe, as opposed to the more careful, pragmatic views of the Chinese. We will now see how that relationship fares in the situation of a war in Ukraine. Of course, there were tensions, but what I think is remarkable is actually how much that relationship has not only held together, but actually has got stronger through the 3 years of war. And it is, in a way, therefore, a kind of an alliance of a kind. I won't call it a full-scale alliance, but I think it is an alliance of a kind built around the kind of ideas and views about the world order, which I've already briefly outlined. But putting it rather simply, the relationship has actually become almost intimate through the war. And in a way, one has become dependent on the other, not just one on the other. Everybody keeps talking about Russia becoming too dependent on China, almost a satellite. I don't believe that. You know, China needs Russia to some degree in the same way that Russia needs China. But I'd simply reinforce the argument of the degree of coincidence of interest. And this just doesn't involve the Ukraine. And that's what I want to really drive at. It comes back to your broad point, Jerome, about what is a rules-based order. They kind of see themselves opposed to this rules-based order, however one wants to define it. They're opposed to liberalism. They're opposed to the notion of liberal interventionism. They often come back to the double standards of the West. They often come back to the notion of sovereignty. We've got to get back to the notion of sovereignty, to the old Westphalian notion of order. None of this opening up of borders through color revolutions, as they define it. And they want to, and Xi Jinping put it very clearly to Putin and Emeritus. He said, we are living at a moment where there's going to be more change than at any time in one century. Quite remarkable statement. In other words, they see the world in massive transition from what we might call, Jerome, however imprecisely, the rules-based order, which is a synonym really for a Western-dominated order, dominated by the United States, and by the way, in association with its European allies. And I'll be interested to hear what Helen has to say about that as well, because Europe's part of this as well, is so-called rules-based liberal order. And I think they see themselves challenging that very, very directly. I'll end on one or two questions. Can the relationship last? If what I've been arguing really for the last 20 years is true or right or correct, then I believe it will do so, yeah. Certainly one thing is clear. Xi Jinping clearly doesn't want to see Putin defeated. And on every diplomatic area, the two positions coincide. China, after all, says, we agree with Russia that the cause of this war is NATO enlargement, not Russia. They don't even call it a war. And in international diplomatic forums, such as the BRICS, in which Russia and China participate fully, again, they push the line that this essentially is something caused by the West in general, NATO in particular, and the United States in the most straightforward sense. So I really don't see this relationship changing fundamentally. Some may have a different view on that, and I'll be interested to hear what they have to say. The one thing I'd say about Trump on this is quite interesting, because I think, for whatever one may think about Trump, I mean, he makes American foreign policy very interesting. Not that it's ever been boring, but it's made it very interesting. I just wonder, if Trump's not got something up his sleeve. It's speculation, Nilanjan. I know you're not very keen on speculation, but I'll speculate a bit, because we have to speculate with Trump, because we simply don't know where anything's moving at the moment. Is it that Trump himself is trying to do a Henry Kissinger, i.e. trying to drive a small wedge between this relation, on the assumption, which is not entirely untrue, that in a sense Western policy and American strategy has actually driven them together, and there may be reasons that one might be able now, in the situation we're now in, to begin to drive a bit of a wedge between them. And I think in that regard, what Trump might be trying to do, in a sense, is drive the wedge by kind of not being nice to China. I don't think he's ever going to be nice to China, but by making some kind of, not rapprochement with China, but some kind of limited concessions to China, even though they regard China as the 21st century great problem for the West, whether they can actually bring that about. But anyway, thanks again for asking me. A few throwaway comments there, Nilanjan. But to come back to Jerome's point, whether we know or call it a rules-based order, there's no question that whatever it was and however we defined it, and whoever defined it first, that order is clearly in a deep crisis, and I see no easy way out of it, particularly now that you've got an American president who doesn't believe in rules or order.
Thank you very much, Mick. And my apologies, but the connectivity at our end at LSE is actually a bit erratic. So just in case you can't hear too much of what I'm saying, but that doesn't matter because I'm not going to say much. Our next speaker is Dr. Ahmed Edi Öztürk, who is Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at London Metropolitan University here in London, and is author of Religion, Identity and Power, Turkey and the Balkans in the 21st Century, which was published in 2021. Ahmed, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thank you for this provocative discussion. I mean, if you permit, before delivering into the topic about Turkey quite detailedly, I would like to briefly address today's main discussion topic. I mean, 2025, a new world order. Indeed, I mean, as the first two speakers mentioned, that the world we inhabit today is not the same as it has been like a decade ago, most probably. I mean, this transformation is not purely attributed to the increasing of the artificial intelligence, the effect of the COVID-19 or the evolving the social networks, but more fundamentally, right now, I think we are witnessing a new global order in terms of geopolitics, most probably, precisely, obviously, security, and likewise Trump, Erdogan, Putin, the policymakers who shape these world domains. I mean, furthermore, I believe that the effects generated by this emerging world order will shape the foundations of the entire new global order in the near future. That is, I wouldn't say that I'm very, very optimistic. So at this point, I think rather than merely asking whether the 2025 will mark a new world order, I think we must also consider the question of what comes next. And within this, I mean, futuristic question, if we aim to examine the complicated and sometimes oxymoronic role of Turkey, as well as the broader regions of the Balkans, the continental Europe, the Middle East, the North Africa, we must focus a couple of turning points. I specifically highlighted these regions such as the Balkans, continental Europe, Middle East, and the North Africa because Turkey, not only geographically, but also historically, with its historical legacy and its status as a middle regional power, Turkey still has significant geostrategical influence and very considerable impact on these areas. I mean, the first critical turning point about not only the world's transformation, world order's transformation, and also Turkey's positionality within this new world order is precisely the Russian invasion of Ukraine, followed by the NATO's expansion through the inclusion of Sweden and Finland. I mean, these developments or the series of the developments demonstrated that in the emerging new world order, the invasion and the expansion can occur into two different but very interconnected directions. While the former Eastern Bloc, or you would call the Russia, seeks to influence and try to occupy some of the parts of the West, like more than years and years and years later, the Euro-Atlantic Security Axis has extended eastward for the first time. I think this is a quite dramatical shift within the understanding of the previous world order. Indeed, the thing that has affected the world and the Turkey a lot, the second fundamental event is what happened after May of the October 7, 2022, Hamas attacks, which led to Israel significantly weaken Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. And beyond it is most probably the expectation of its limits. This shift obviously has triggered the border re-enlargements and particularly the impact of Iran and other long-standing power centers in the Middle East. I think these two developments, on the one hand side, one is in the east, the other one is in the west, but at the same time, the other one is in the north, the other was in the south, have set in motion a new profound political, sociological, economical, geostrategical transformations And if you think a little bit about geopolitically and geographically, Turkey has been standing like in the center of all of these transformations, conflicts, and currently some cooperations. Beyond that, as the first two speakers mentioned, Europe's increasing vulnerabilities, as reflected in the latest Borrellis report, the internal struggles within the state structure of the United States. If I'm not mistaken, yesterday night it has been underlined from Elon Musk. He describes this as the war against bureaucracy, suggests that we are like currently stressing the limits of the classical familiar world order. Right now, I wouldn't necessarily evaluate this transformation or this stretching positively or negatively, but I think I see it as an objective assessment of the shifting global landscapes. Go back to Turkey right now. I mean, we have to be honest about one situation. Over the last 10, 12 years, Turkey has been governing by an increasingly repressive regime. Currently, the country faces a highly polarized social structure and a very fragile economy compared to the past. But, however, despite these negative, problematic, pejorative facts and many other changes, Turkey still managed to recognize itself as an emerging global order, global actor within this new emerging global order. First of all, what we need to underline, Turkey is an important regional power, but at the same time, because of its geography's structure, it can operate within a region that has the capacity to shape and influence the global politics. Just remember, before the transition period of the American presidency, how many times Trump mentioned that how Erdogan is a strong political actor and how he is important not only for the Middle East, but also it's for the Caucasus, for the Eastern Europe, and for the Southeastern Europe as well. That is why this recognition underscores the idea that if Turkey can establish itself as an influential actor within its region, and also Turkey can also extend its influence in a global scale. In this context, I think as a global security concerns identify, Turkey is redefining its power, even though on the paper, it can be very easily defined as a regional middle power. Turkey, through its military investments, positioning itself in a crucial point within this new world order. Secondly, Turkey has currently has been moving beyond the traditional understanding of friend and enemy distinctions. It is no longer identified, Turkey is no longer identifies itself strictly within a single geopolitical or normative bloc and positionalize itself, which itself as an actor can be in a relation between different blocs or different groups within the world politics. For example, while Turkey seeks to receive or modernize the custom union negotiations with the European Union, it also simultaneously engaging with the BRICS countries. This dual approach suggests that Turkey aims to function as both as a Western country and also as an Eastern actor in the new world order. This, from my point of view, this approach seems increasingly increasingly important in some turning points, in some critical junctions in the world history. Notably, until the Donald Trump's presidency, President Erdogan, Turkey's president, was the only NATO leader who maintained direct dialogue with the Russian President Putin, highlighting this also highlighting Turkey's ability to navigate complex geopolitical dynamics, because thanks to this quote unquote, this negotiation, Turkey has managed to solve the grain deal issue and give a little bit of a break to the Northern African countries. Furthermore, Turkey is currently diversifying its foreign policy tools and, again, redefining its role within the new global order. It is not only employing one-layer strategy currently, even though some of them are clashing each other, that I think we need to talk about it. It is employing a multi-layered strategy with a cooperation with the traditional diplomatic instruments. I mean, for example, what we saw that this is also an evidence in its role in Syria, where it maintains in relations with Iran, while actively and currently shaping the religion dynamics within the new Syrian regime. I mean, similarly, in the context of Ukraine, Turkey within this new world order supports Kiev's resistance while ensuring that Russia is not entirely excluded from the international system. And this nuance and the multi-phased foreign policy approach underscores Turkey's attempt to carve out a distinct and autonomous role itself in the newly emerging world order. Again, the similar.
Ahmed, I think maybe we should, if you could wrap up, and maybe we can come back to some of the other points.
Definitely. I mean, this is the Turkey's new positionality within the new world order. But despite Turkey's active role in regional and the global affairs, despite Turkey's some of the critical problem solver positions, we should at the same time consider that Turkey has been using its foreign policy, its foreign influence or the foreign image to justify some of the repressive policies in the domestic politics. I think, the Jerom's article in the new statement, Turkey's contribution could be that how some of the actors' activities in the new global order will affect their domestic politics. Because what we saw that there is no crystal clear cut right now from United States to Turkey or to India. There is no gap between foreign policy and the domestic politics. I think one of the main issues, looking from the Turkey's current perspective, right now, the level of the overlap between domestic politics and the foreign policy has reached its peak point. I think this is a new issue that we need to scrutinize to understand what is next or what comes next. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have rushed you, but we are running slightly short of time. Professor Helen Siersen is research professor at the Arena Center for European Studies at the University of Oslo, and we had circulated her article, and she's author of Rethinking Liberal Order, the EU and the Quest for Global Justice. Professor Siersen, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Niljan. And first of all, I'd like to thank Niljan Sarkar and the LSE for inviting me to take part in this distinguished panel. I'm very happy to be here. It's hard to talk about world order these days. Everything is up in the air. So what I will try to do is to reflect a little on how we can conceive of the EU's own understanding of world order and how it situates itself in this order. So my starting point is that, notwithstanding the double standards of this approach, clearly pointed out by Jerome, the European Union has traditionally defined itself as a kind of a vanguard of a multilateral order, also referred to as a rules-based order, but perhaps more clearly anchored in international law. So the question is this still the case in the present context, or do we see any changes in the way the European Union understands its own role and how it approaches a global order? And I find it difficult to pin down. I see some changes, but at the same time, it's also clear that there is an internal process ongoing in the European Union where they are actually amongst themselves rethinking and debating where to go in these uncertain times. So I would like to illustrate the tensions and the different ways in which we might actually understand the European Union's approach by just looking at what it does, in particular in the European region. And my sort of a conceptual starting point is to think that we might understand the European Union as sticking to a multilateralist international law-based agenda, or we might, as an alternative, characterize it as an actor that is increasingly moving in the direction of understanding world order as more in a power political way, and then also shifting its own approach in order to fit with that. So that's the kind of the tension that I suggest, just to have something to measure what the EU does, to measure it up against. So what does this look like when the European Union acts in its own region? Three things characterizes the European Union's approach at the moment. The first one is that it is clearly working to strengthen its own economic position. We see discussions of reforms of industrial policy. There's the whole Draghi report, which emphasizes the need for the European Union to innovate and to be much more competitive in the global economy. So that's a first sort of common trait of the European Union's approach at the moment to its place in the world, being more competitive and a stronger economic actor. Secondly, the European Union seeks to stabilize the neighborhood, as it calls it. So that's the sort of the group of countries that border the European Union in the east, but also in the Mediterranean. At the core here, of course, is the support for Ukraine in response to Russia's illegal attack on Ukraine. Perhaps this is where the international law multilateral logic is the most visible at the moment, in the sense that the justification for the European Union's strong involvement in Ukraine is the reference to the breach of international law. So rather than think of this as a kind of motivated by a geopolitical logic, I do think that here we can say we see evidence of a law-based approach. The third point, or the third factor in the European Union's development of its foreign policy at the moment is that it is intensifying the work to strengthen its capabilities in defense. So there is a clear target of developing a European defense industry. There is now a commissioner for defense supervising these moving defense into the realm of the European Commission rather than leaving it exclusively with the member states is also a clear signal that coercive military capabilities is something that the European Union wants to be able to dispose of. How it's going to play out in institutional terms, we don't really know yet, but that is clearly an element in the shift in the European Union's approach to global order. So in this regional context, which I do think is where the European Union's foreign policy efforts are really concentrated at the moment, much more than at the global level, there seems to be a kind of a mix of a geopolitical logic and, if we can talk about that, or more power political logic and a sense of a need to show strength and to even be able to threaten with the use of force. And on the other hand, the attachment still to a multilateral and a law-based approach to international order. Now, as the European Union at least partly develops a more realist approach to international order, this might at some point have the unintended effect of also changing slightly the European Union's own self-understanding. While the European Union has traditionally seen itself as a kind of open-ended polity, where the idea of transcending borders, which is at the core of the idea of the European Union, has also been part of the motivation for the EU's foreign policy. Now the European Union is de facto faced not only with the objective of transcending borders, but at the same time of protecting them. So this makes perhaps in the long term for a different basis to justify and explain the need for the European Union itself, and might affect its identity in the long run. So that's what it looks like at the regional level. If we move then to the global level, what can we say about the tensions and changes in EU foreign policy and in its approach to global order? Here I see more of a continuity rather than a change, although I do think the change might be that the emphasis is clearly on the regional basis. There are limits to how much the European Union can actually do in foreign policy, and this seems to be where it is focusing the most. At the global level, however, the European Union still portrays itself as a supporter of multilateralism. Now, as multilateralism is also, or the current form of multilateralism is also contested, the question is, how does the European Union situate itself in response to that contestation? And it seems to me that there are two options that the European Union could go for. One would be to try to save multilateralism by protecting it as is. Another would be to think of saving multilateralism through reforming the system. So, and here, I do think that there are few signs that the European Union is actually thinking of reforming and reconceptualizing multilateralism, and that the tendency rather seems to be on protecting multilateralism. So if I miss something here in the EU's approach to global order, it would be that in order to actually succeed, in my view, in terms of actually rescuing some form of multilateral order, it would need to develop a more reflexive approach based on an acknowledgement that in order to gain the support it seems to want for a multilateral order, you have to promote a kind of multilateral order that others can accept. This is where the reflexivity comes in. So far, the European Union seems to have approached the support for multilateralism as based on the idea that they already know what is the right form of multilateralism that is required. And this might be so, but then they forget that in order to get the support of others, these others also need to be able to shape that multilateral order. So the need for participation and for a more responsive approach to a support of multilateralism is perhaps a way forward for the European Union at the global level, to the extent that this is at all possible in the rather unpredictable context it is operating these days. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you very much. We have one question, and I'm just going to announce that if anyone watching would like to ask questions, please do type them now. I'll post the questions later. But Jerome, would you like to come back in now and say what you have to about any ideas that you have about what has been said, or to take this discussion forward?
Well, I mean, so much has been said that it's really hard to encapsulate everything, because I think what we're witnessing, I mean, we're living through a moment of great flux. I think that's pretty clear. And I think that everyone in this moment, all the different players within the changing world order, are trying to reposition themselves. And so we get all these fascinating questions that have come up in the contributions of our three earlier speakers about how their specific areas of expertise are changing in relation to these dynamics. It's really unfortunate that Sanjay couldn't make it, of course, completely understandable, but it would have been fascinating to hear what is the role of the Global South in all of this. Can we speak of the Global South as a unitary actor? Probably not. But if we're going to sort of speak as a sort of another pole here that we have not yet been able to really talk about, that would be the question that comes up for me. The developing world. What role will it play in this re-emerging order? So if any of the speakers have any thoughts on this, I'd be very interested to know. I think that what came up for me are a number of perhaps questions in relation to specific regions that we could discuss. I don't want to make it a Q&A where I ask a question and then we go back and forth, but maybe I can just launch, sort of throw up a ball, and then we can take the conversation from there, and the speakers should feel free to sort of interact with each other and respond to each other. But I think that one thing that came up for me is this, for instance, this thing that that Ahmet mentioned in relation to the role of Turkey as a pivotal and increasingly autonomous player, sort of middle power that tries to play different sides. And I think that is something that would have perhaps come up in a conversation about the role of the Global South as well. Like what role can a country like Mexico or Brazil play in trying to, in a sense, play both sides. And with both sides, I mean, on the one hand, the West, and on the other hand, perhaps Russia and China as the main contestants. But I'd be curious also to sort of talk about, what that could mean for the European Union, for instance. So we have this sort of shifting dynamic where some players are starting to realize that they have more space for autonomy, more space perhaps for charting an independent course, because they don't necessarily need to follow either the Western line or go against the Western line. They can judge individual issues and where they stand, and take them as they come. And so perhaps for Professor Sjursen, for Helene, I'd be curious to ask, do you see a role for the European Union as a more autonomous player, akin to what Ahmet was mentioning in relation to Turkey, to sort of play different sides, to perhaps not always follow the line that comes out of Washington, and perhaps chart its more independent course, perhaps along the lines of what President Macron of France has always kind of pined for. Do you see any space for that emerging, or not at all?
If I could just, Ahmet, I noticed that you raised your hand, so I'm going to come back to you at a point. If I could just add one more thing as a non-expert, but this is about the point that Jerome made about playing different sides, which was taken from Ahmet's point, is there is also the additional point that was made, for instance, when the Russia-Ukraine conflict and Russia's invasion broke out, where India said that it was really a European problem, that it was not, it was not something that India saw as a problem, which is the reason why India continued to buy oil from Russia. So there is also a question of perspective. Now, for a student like for someone like me who's a student of history, it's very interesting because India and India's historiography has the same argument for the First World War, where more than 1.2 million soldiers came from the subcontinent and fought as part of the Commonwealth Army, but looked at it as a European war. Right. So there is not just a question of playing all sides or both sides or many sides, but also a question of literally the perspective of viewing it and therefore positioning one's own interest in the context of how you view a certain event or incident, which may be of central importance and concern to another part of the world. For instance, the Russia-Ukraine war for the European Union in particular, but more generally the Western world. But Helen, did you want to come in and respond to it? And then I know, Mick, you've raised your hand and Emmett has also raised his hand. So yeah, if you could be brief, and then we can just go around and we can take questions as well.
Thank you. Yes, I'll be brief. I'll start with the question of Ukraine and whether or not it's Europe's problem. I think it depends what you consider to be at stake in Ukraine. Is it only about is it a competition for power within the European region? Then the argument that it's Europe's problem would be perhaps more plausible. But if you see it as more of a global, if you see it more as a principled problem, that there's been a fundamental breach of international law, then I think it's more difficult to argue that it is only Europe's problem. Of course, the issue of double standards comes up, and for sure, if you look to the Middle East and to Gaza, it's clear that there are double standards going on. So. But I'm not sure that the double standards can actually exempt actors from taking a stand on this kind of principled issue. So is it Europe's problem? Well, if it's a principled problem about a breach of international law, then it's not only Europe's problem. And it doesn't mean that we can disregard that because there are breaches of international law elsewhere as well. Then those breaches are also an international problem. So when it comes to this question of whether there's room for the European Union to play a more independent role in the same way as for example, Turkey is trying to do that, and not choosing sides in a way, I think you see parts of that in the EU's current efforts to change and reform, and you see it in this concept of strategic autonomy, which is, of course, perhaps not very realistic, but still a clear target and objective for the European Union. And that really, if you think of the notion of autonomy, that's really a matter of not only capabilities, but it's about being able to set your own agenda. That's the sort of the essential idea of autonomy. So I guess parts of that logic is also present in Europe. Whether it means that the European Union is going to play both sides, I'm less sure, because when Turkey, for example, argues that it's going to play both sides, it's really an argument that is aimed at the European Union and the US, right? So it's a kind of logic that you don't really find in EU politics. But the notion of a stronger position to define one's own agenda, I think that's something that is also present in the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. I should say over here and perhaps clarify that I'm not an expert. I'm not entirely sure that the word problem was used, but the position was, the official position was, because I just checked it up on the internet while you were speaking, that, you know, India respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, and the global order is anchored in international law, the UN Charter, and respect for territorial integrity. So you know, it took sort of this kind of a position, but yes, it obviously did not respond to and continued its you know, commercial relations with Russia. So I think that's the point I was trying to make, but thank you very much. Ahmed, you had raised your hand first, and then make you.
Yeah, I mean, as an academic who has been scrutinizing the Turkey's evaluation, both domestically and foreign policy base, I wouldn't say, or not only for Turkey, but like for a couple of countries as well, I wouldn't use the term of playing different sides. Right now, middle powers within this new world order have realized that they have different alternatives. Because what was the general, I mean, I would define as a non-academic, with a non-academic language. Previously, Western club has been treating Turkey and the other middle powers, that most of the Balkanic powers, Balkanic countries as well, as the EU or the Western club was the only option. If you would like to democratize yourself, here we are. If you would like to develop your economy, here we are. If you would like to reach like certain standards about road, about production, for many things, we are your standards right now. Right now, these countries can see that they can move different sides. It doesn't mean that playing a dirty gambling game, okay? EU, if you're not accepting me as a member, I'll go to BRICS. No, this is not like that. But at the same time, this is the diplomacy, right? And I mean, currently, for example, if you consider the Turkey, I mean, Turkey has been playing a role in the East Mediterranean, right? Southeast Europe, Russia, Ukraine war, Caucasus, Turkey countries in the Central Asia, Middle East, including Syria, Northern Iraq, Iran, and playing with, like be active in the Gulf countries as well. So in these circumstances, I mean, the international law, obviously it is our standard, but the level of the relations between Turkey and the EU is right now -1. I think it is fair, equal and transparent to move these relations from -1 to 0, because I mean, EU wants to involve the process of the re-establishing institutions or the new development of the state structure within the Syria. But how? Is there any gap? Or anyone wants any support from EU directly? If yes, how these supports will go? Who's going to be your partner? Like more than 6 decades years old NATO member Turkey or another actor? So in these circumstances, I think this is not only the issue of Turkey-EU relations, but also it is an issue for every single country, including United States, UK, any single countries right now. Every single country has been recognized in the international global order. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the number of these countries is 1979, has different options, and their leverage to play within the international diplomacy is larger than a decade or 2 decades ago. This is what I would like to try to say. That I wouldn't say that it is extremely fair, but the previous world order wasn't fair as well. So this is a new rule. So I think I wouldn't say that like the world is this extremely peaceful, everything will gonna go very smoothly. Look at the level of the militarization. If we're gonna talk about the new world order, we have to talk about the militarization of the foreign policies of the countries. So this is, I mean, we are in a transition period, and I think it is important for us to read what is going on right now to understand what may happen tomorrow.
Sure.
This is what I would like to say.
Okay, great. Mick, go ahead, please.
Briefly, if you're a good old-fashioned realist, you could say, well, frankly, what we're seeing now is only a repetition of what we've been seeing for the last few hundred years in terms of international relations. After all, if you follow a realist perspective, and some of us sometimes try to, and sometimes not, we live in a state of anarchy, and there is no central government. It's anarchic by virtue of the fact that states dominate the system still, and importantly, two great powers dominate the system. And without making the case only for great powers alone, and I'll say something in a minute, it's quite amazing, really, what we're looking at today. It is still, and I take the points made about Turkey and indeed about India seriously, but in some ways, there are three great powers which are still shaping and dominating the world out there, and they're great powers. One is clearly the United States, which still controls 23% of world GDP and spends more on the military than anybody else put together. Secondly, of course, is Russia, a one-time declining power, but a power which is trying to reassert itself. And in some ways, I often explain Putinism not purely as a Russian phenomenon growing out of Russian history, but as a sense of declining power, which has done something which declining powers very rarely try to do, which is reassert itself as a great power. And there's much of a great power kind of reassertiveness about Putin, which explains much of what he's been doing over the last 20 years. And last but by no means least in terms of great powers, there's China. So in some ways, Neil and Jen, if I can be somewhat kind of boring and realist, there's nothing new about much of this, because what we're seeing is powers, great powers themselves, still shaping the world today in ways around which everybody else orients. You know, we kind of fly like satellites around the three great powers, if we're perfectly honest about it. Europe clearly still, you know, rotates around the United States. China and Russia rotate around each other, and much of the global south is, in a sense, pulled between both what we might call the dominant north and China. So what's new? And that's the question I think Jerome was trying to pose in his original piece in the New Statesman, Jerome. And if I could say, I think there's three things new. There's many things new, but let's keep it brief. What's new and remarkably new is not just the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it's the rise of China. I mean, this is what makes everything new. You know, and it's not a Soviet Union without money. It's China with a lot of money. And sorry to be blunt and reduce it all to materialism, but simply the sheer economic reach of China now shifts everything. It changes everything. It changes everything in the global south. It changes everything in relationship to Latin America, in relationship to Africa. And when you've got an economy which is now the second largest in the world, with a technology which nobody ever forecast, this really is a shift changer, as dear old Paul Kennedy would have said back in 1987 in his great book on the rise and fall of great powers. It's a great technological economic changes that have been brought about by reforms in China, many other things, which changes everything. I think the second thing is, and it comes into the points made by my colleagues, you know, the rise of middle powers. I don't want to be overly focused on great powers to the detriment and ignoring everything else, but clearly middle powers are playing a much bigger role now. Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned Turkey, and I agree entirely with what you said earlier. But, you know, I've been studying places like Indonesia, you know, not insignificant players in the international order. You know, South Korea, middle power, non-nuclear, but nonetheless still playing a pretty remarkably important role in East Asia. And indeed, if we can think of the EU as a power, Helen, I mean, and I think one should, I mean, in a way, it is playing a role within the world, much criticized and kind of denigrated by others, but still playing a role. It wasn't playing this kind of role 30, 40, 50 years ago. I suppose the third and final new thing about it all, really, and it's a term I'm not entirely happy with, but everybody uses it, so I better kind of use it, is the global south. I mean, I grew up studying the Cold War, and of course there were two superpowers, we were told, and then there was something else called the Third World, of which India, of course, was renowned as the major leader in those far-off days, Neil and Jan, was it not? Now, I don't think the global south is a reproduction, you know, Mark II, a 2.0 of the Third World. But nonetheless, there is a way in which the global south either has defined itself or been defined as actor. And again, that is complicating and making everything much more difficult to forecast. We mentioned one thing, the Ukraine war. Now, actually, the overwhelming number of countries in the so-called global south actually, in the end, condemned the Russian invasion. Let's be clear about it. But nonetheless, there were 34 who kind of abstained and who kind of look at the Ukraine war. And this is where the double standards that you were talking about, Helen, comes in, doesn't it? Well, the double standards of the West is you support Ukraine, you talk about human rights, Russian aggression. What about Gaza? What about Israel? The double standards thing. But however one defines the global south, there's no question that this is now an entity, whether in imagination or in reality. And that, again, is making the world we're living in today far more complicated, far unknowable, and by the way, far more dangerous. It's not because I'm saying the global south makes the world dangerous. I think we've got to emphasize this as well by way of final conclusion. I think we are living in very dangerous times. I mean, it's bad enough, but it could get worse. And I think we've got to kind of hold on to our hats. I'm not going to predict World War III, as some people are doing, but nonetheless, there's a lot of inflammatory material out there, which makes the future deeply unknowable, deeply uncertain, and I think deeply dangerous.
Thank you. Shall I just read out the question that we have, which is to all of you, so you can take turns in answering, but also gives all of you some time to gather further thoughts. I'm going to read the question out as it has been typed because I don't want to paraphrase someone else's question. If enlightenment is always the answer, then why is it we find ourselves in the predicament today? Could it be that we are off balance? That's the question.
Wow.
Jerome, do you want to go first?
Well, if I may, I'll briefly respond to Professor Cox, to Mick, if I may, because I think I'm very glad he raised the question of China, because I think this is kind of like, this is hovering over everything. It's always there in the background, and I think it's the fundamental question of our time. There are many shifts taking place, but I think the rise of China is really the fundamental shift when it comes to the question of world order, and it's indeed what I was trying to get at in that article, in terms of trying to understand the framing behind the rules-based international order language as a response to that rise of China. And maybe I can also throw up a ball here for Ahmet and Helen, because I'd be very curious to hear what you think in terms of your specific regions of expertise, like how are Turkey and the European Union addressing this fundamental shift in the international balance of power. And one thing that I also wanted to mention is, it absolutely is. I also read this as a very dangerous moment, and I think that one of the great fears, of course, is that something might happen in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait that would set off a conflict unlike any we've ever seen before. If that were to happen, I think that's precisely where these type of questions become relevant. What position does the EU take? What position does the UK take? What position does a country like Turkey take? Because that type of conflict inevitably will involve regional players, but it will also involve the United States. And the United States will have an interest in universalizing that conflict. So what would happen from there would quickly spiral into something significantly larger. So perhaps that's something that we can address as well. As for the question of enlightenment, I'm not sure if I completely understand the meaning of the word enlightenment in this context, whether it refers to either sort of a philosophical sense referring to 18th century European enlightenment, or
I should say, sorry to interrupt, I should say that the word enlightenment is within quotes. So I would imagine that it sort of means that in its manifest.
Right. Well, I can only respond to an area where I have some knowledge, which would be enlightenment in the context of the 18th century Age of Enlightenment in Europe. And one thing that I would say about it is that, the fundamental idea that I think came out of that period is the idea of progress. It's the idea that we are gradually and steadily marching towards an improved condition, that this is a universal process that involves all of humanity, and that this will eventually spread to all corners of the globe. And I think that what we are witnessing today is not necessarily a challenge to the possibility that there might be improvement in the world, but a challenge to the idea that there is an overarching law in history that directs us all the time towards a better outcome. And I think that what we're witnessing is a fundamental rupture, if you will, in a set of processes that take us back to the post-war period, that are going to fundamentally change the world in ways that we cannot fully anticipate and cannot yet fully predict. And perhaps that will take us away from some of the values and some of the beliefs that were at the heart of the order that emerged out of the 18th century Enlightenment. So the ideas of liberalism that were so triumphant seemingly in the 1990s may not look as triumphant 30 or 40 or 50 years from now. Yet I don't think that we can make any predictions at this stage that is inevitably what's going to result. I still think that, you know, we are in a moment of flux, a moment of tremendous power struggles, also a moment of tremendous ideological struggles that could end up going in many different directions. So I wouldn't want to predict at this stage where we are headed. But if that was the intention of the question, to refer to this 18th century Enlightenment, then I would say that it's facing challenges on a scale that, you know, the last time that it witnessed those type of challenges were really during the 1930s. And I think that this is a fundamental pivot that's taking place. That's where I would leave it for now.
Okay, thank you. Mick, I know you want to speak, but if we could just go quickly to Hélène to,
sure.
Would you like to respond both to the point that Jerome made about EU-Turkey, as also the question that was asked about enlightenment, and if we've always relied on that as the answer, then how have we found ourselves in this situation today?
Difficult questions. If we think of enlightenment as instead of as a triumphant liberalism, but rather as the embodiment of the principles of freedom, equality, and solidarity, it seems to me that this is what is at stake today. As Mike said, we live in very dangerous times. And it seems to me that these principles are really under threat. Whether we should refer to that as a sort of out of balance, I'm less sure. But perhaps in the long run, we can think of it trying to be optimistic here as a way to rethink how to realize the principles of freedom, equality, and solidarity in the long run, and learn from past mistakes. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. Mick.
Very briefly, I always go back to the Cold War on this, because I've always thought of the Cold War not just in strategic or ideological terms, but in a sense, a battle of two enlightenments. A battle of two notions of the future, both rooted in Enlightenment principles, one deriving, if you like, from liberal capitalism, Adam Smith, on the one side, if you wish, and the other one deriving from Marxism, which is, after all, the expression of Enlightenment, which came through the thoughts and ideas of Marx and Engels. Now, however, both may have got distorted in the telling of a very different kind of struggle, but nonetheless, I've always thought of that in some broader philosophical sense as a battle for futures around two Enlightenment principles. Whether you agree with them or not doesn't really matter from that point of view. What I think, and what those principles were, going back to what Jerome said and Hélène, I mean, there are two things which sort of come out of that, really. One is about optimism, about the future. You know, we will bury you, said Khrushchev. Well, he meant basically, you know, socialism will prove its superiority as a socio-economic and cultural system, or we will bury you, said Richard Nixon, because we will show that capitalism and liberalism will work better. But in a sense, both were optimistic about their futures, however it turned out. And I'm not quite sure we're in that kind of world any longer. I'd also say two other things very briefly. One, the West was self-confident after the end of the Cold War, enormously so. It was even, you know, when it won the Cold War, if you like, it defeated, there was a kind of a wild optimism, maybe a hubris, a kind of end of history kind of argument. We're way beyond that now, are we not, Jerome, Helen, and, you know, we're way beyond that now. There's a kind of a deep pessimism, it seems to me, running around the West about even what the West means. We even put the word West in inverted commas in the same way that people tend to put the word Enlightenment. The other final point I'd make about this, and again, this leads me to pessimism, but ultimately I'm an optimistic human being. It's a kind of notion of science, you know, based on scientific rationality, measurement, reflection, rational debate, rational discussion. Again, in answer to the very good question, really, and I'm not sure about the off balance, but we're living, it seems to me, more and more in an era where science is sometimes being popularly questioned. Disinformation, the uses of disinformation, I mean, having a major impact on people's thinking. Even the question of even questioning experts, is very, very typical kind of anti-enlightenment kind of argument. I'm not saying all experts are right all the time, but it's a great question. And I think it brings me to that point that, this is what makes me more pessimistic about the period which we are living, actually more pessimistic than I was during the Cold War, which contained some pretty frightening moments. But at least you could actually understand what both sides were saying to each other. And even if there wasn't really proper peaceful coexistence, there was some notion about a rational debate about different kinds of futures. One future won and the other one failed.
Thank you, Mick. Eddie.
Thank you. I mean, I would most probably underline some of the parts of the Mick's responses. I mean, about enlightenment, how I categorically rejected the term of the playing to different sides. I am rejecting the use of the enlightenment within the current circumstances. I think we have many different kings and the queens of the darkness instead of enlightenment. I mean, I'm not sure whether you're aware or not. A couple of days ago, some of the right-wing European Union leaders established a meeting, and they signed a declaration to glorify the Trump's administration and the ideology. And if I think it's the end of February, there will be an election in Germany, and there will be an election upcoming in France. If they would take over by the right-wing political actors, United Kingdom will be the only single major player in the Western countries running by the Labour countries, excluding the Scandinavian countries. This is the first side of the coin. The second side of the coin, yesterday, there was a meeting about the EU and Western countries and the AI regulations. Two countries didn't sign the declaration. One is the Trump's United Kingdom. The other one is the Labour, Trump's United States. The other one is the Labour Party's United Kingdom. On the other hand, in the Southeastern European countries or the South countries, we have been witnessing an heterosexual, masculine, neo-patriarchal, repressive leaders' brothership. Erdogan, Orban, Vucic, Modi, so on and so forth. So I wouldn't, most probably, I am way more pessimist than Mick, because I am 38 years old, and personally, living any of my heads as an academic, so on and so forth, I have a 5 years old daughter. What gonna be happen with this increasement angerness over those militarization and over those insecure use of AI? So I think, the change of the rapid is way faster than the capture abilities of the humankind. That is why I'm very much afraid of the next levels. The last point is that, okay, there is also a power struggle between different countries. I don't know, one of my colleagues mentioned that there is also an ideological conflict. Yes, but the instrumentalization of the current representative democracy is limiting the discussions between different ideologies, because, okay, I won the election, so it's over the discussion. So what, just observe what will happen in the United States over the next 4 years. I am very pessimistic.
Thank you. We've almost perfectly timed ourselves, and I know that there has been a hint, or a whiff of lack of optimism, especially that which is generated by technology, but and the technology that we live with now. But I always say at the end of these events that I do, wonderful as they are, and each one is wonderful, and the learning curve for me is that if there was anything good that came out of the COVID pandemic, it is that we all became very technologically savvy in using Zoom. And that has definitely been an upside. What it has allowed us to do in sort of centers like ours is that it allows us to bring together experts like yourselves, who are spread so far apart from one another, and bring it to audiences who are interested to hear it through the ease of technology. But that said, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your expertise. We cannot do these events if you don't give freely of your time and your expertise. So thank you very much. We really do appreciate it very, very much that all of you take time out and leave aside what you have to do for these discussions. It's been absolutely fascinating, and a recording of this will go up on our website very soon, by tomorrow morning. So it remains only for me to thank first Jerome Yu, Jerome Roos, Mick Cox, Ahmed Erdi Öztürk, and Helen Searson. Thank you very much, everyone. And we hope to have you on programs and events later on in due course as this expands and the conversation continues. But for the moment, thank you and goodbye.